So let's begin, and I'm sure we'll have some people tuning in a bit late. Welcome to this special webinar. My name is Dr. Stephen Sussman. I am an associate professor of public administration in the Andreas School of Business at Barry University in Miami, and co-founder of the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research. Dr. Luis Fleischman and I, along with a dedicated team of colleagues, established the center as an outlet for the marketplace of ideas. Oops. 1 second. The Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is a 501c3 nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center, and a think tank. We are a gathering of scholars, experts, and community stakeholders engaged in research and dialogue in an effort to create practical policy recommendations to current local, national, and international challenges. Therefore, the center encourages discussion and research from multiple perspectives. We believe that good policy is the result of reasonable dialogue and healthy debate. We believe in the marketplace of ideas. Thus, through publishing balanced articles and community engagement, the center aspires to provide a platform for critical thinking, analysis, and ideas to confront challenges that affect our world. So please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org. On the site, you will also see a donation link. We look to you for support. In return, we provide high-quality webinars on current issues. This evening, the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research, in partnership with Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa, is thrilled to present a very compelling webinar titled Academic Scholarship versus Ideology, Israel and the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement. We're so honored to have such a highly esteemed guest, Dr. Asaf Romirowsky. In a moment, I will introduce him. And I'm sorry, Asaf, for butchering your name. However, we do have some procedural issues to cover. First, we welcome your questions. We want your questions. During the presentation, you can write your questions in the chat box. You can also email me your question at Stephen, S-T-E-P-H-E-N, at palmbeachdemocracy.org. Dr. Romirowsky will speak for about 20-25 minutes. I'll serve as the moderator. The remainder of the hour will be your opportunity to ask questions. First and foremost, please mute your microphones. Dr. Romirowsky is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, SPME, and the Executive Director of the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa. He is also a Senior Non-Resident Research Fellow at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and an affiliate professor at the University of Haifa. We do have that in common. Trained as a Middle East historian, he holds a Ph.D. in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College in London, and has published widely on various aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict and American foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as on Israeli and Zionist history. Dr. Romirowsky is co-author of Religion, Politics, and the Origins of Palestine Refugee Relief, and the author or co-author of many journal articles and book chapters on topics related to international relations in the Middle East. His publicly engaged scholarship has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, the Times of Israel, the Jerusalem Post, Ynet, and Tablet, among other online and print media outlets. His organization, the Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, is a grassroots community of scholars who have united to promote fact-based and civil discourse, especially in regard to Middle East issues. Unfortunately, there are increasing anti-Israel and anti-Semitic forces that have made their way to the college campuses today. SPME's mission is to inform, motivate, and encourage faculty to use their academic skills and disciplines on campus, in classrooms, and in academic publications to develop effective responses to ideological distortions, including anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist slanders that poison the debate and work against peace. I'd like to welcome Dr. Romirowsky to our stage and begin with a simple question. For those who may not know, can you explain what is meant by academic scholarship versus ideology, the title of your presentation?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the warm welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Luis, for affording me the opportunity, and it's great to see all of you here tonight. Some familiar names and faces, which is always nice to see as we live in this still COVID environment. So hopefully we can get an opportunity at some point to do this in person. So, to frame your question, and to kind of try to dive into some of these issues, when you're talking about scholarship and you're talking about ideology, I think that those of us in the wheelhouse of the academy, I think many of us got into it for inquisitive research, trying to find truth. Institutions like universities all around and colleges have been those kind of forums that have allowed us to find and research and do the kind of work that many of us seek to do in order to produce an output that would lend itself to students of all ages to understand areas, and this specifically, in my area of discipline, Middle East, to understand what is the reality on the ground. The ideological component, which I think has, really taken over the environment that we're seeing today, is really a factor of where I would argue that scholarship has been replaced with propaganda and ideology, where individuals are basically using and spewing their own political viewpoints from the universities, from their classroom podiums, in order to really, I would say, indoctrinate their students as far as the reality that's happening in many of these areas. That's part of, I think that's a way to kind of to start with, with that point. I think it's also important to note when you're trying to, and I'll, try to contextualize this, to your point, Stephen, is the fact that since the 1960s, we've really seen in North America a movement of what I would call scholar activists or scholar warriors, individuals who've basically started to promote their own propaganda narrative versus actual inquisitive research. And so activism in the sense of protests and form of boycotts, sit-ins, those kind of fanfare that has been used by scholars, while at the same time using their role and their positions and their titles, has basically become their bona fides rather than actually producing real scholarship. I mean, that's something that we've seen a significant growth of since the 1960s. Do you want me to continue from there, or do you want me? I can't hear you.
Absolutely continue, yes.
Okay, sorry. Good. Okay, so with all of that in mind, I mean, I think that, and again, the talk was, we entitled today's talking to kind of the understanding of the ideology versus the scholarship. The pivotal point I think that everybody should understand is really how all of this relates to BDS and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which I would argue is probably the most pernicious movement in general. It is a global movement that has become the number one springboard for political activism and anti-Semitism at large, and what you're seeing today in North America. The BDS movement is, in its current configuration, is something that we need to understand its origins. And really the origins of a lot of this scholarship and so-called scholarship, or maybe I would say propaganda, goes back to the 1960s. Really, the BDS movement it finds its origins, historical origins, in the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, under Yasser Arafat and company, with the understanding in the 1960s, in particular, that there was an understanding within Palestinian politics that in order to win over the hearts and minds in the West, we may not be able to totally take over Israel militarily, but what we will be able to do, and those of us in the social sciences consider it to be the use of what we know as soft power, we'll be able to use by hijacking agents of influence, such as the media, such as the academy. And this predominantly happened, from an historical standpoint. There was a significant growth in these kind of issues after the Six-Day War. There was a pouring of monies, billions and billions of dollars that have gone into funding area studies. There have gone into funding, a kind of a Palestinianization of trying to understand the phenomenon, of what's going on. And this was kind of the pushback that has taken place in order to create an alternate narrative that has taken place here. Furthermore, again, post the Six-Day War, there was also a growth in the funding, Arab states funding departments and chairs in North America at large. So you've seen a significant growth of a lot of Saudi money that has been poured into North American universities, with the clear intention that if one buys the chair or department, one also buys the politics in which these topics are being taught. So that's the historical political background to how they got into, were able to get into the academy at large. There was also something known as GUPS, the General Union for Palestine Students. Again, a movement that was happening in the 1960s in Berkeley. Many of the individuals who are involved today with Palestinian groups, namely in particular groups like the SJP, the Students for Justice in Palestine, or the MSA, the Muslim Student Associations and whatnot, got their footing and got their hold in the beginning by getting involved in groups like GUPS, with the intention of capturing the narrative, telling the story the way they want it to be told. And all of this is critically important to understand, because by the time what I would consider to be the modern day BDS movement ratifies itself, and that took place after the Durban conference. Now we had Durban 2, but back in 2005, in Durban, South Africa, part of the commission over there was to start, this idea of propagating BDS throughout the world. Many of you may remember seeing massive banners and slogans of Zionism is racism and things of the sort, and calling for apartheid. These are all the things that were ratified in Durban. The Durban tactic and the Durban strategy lent itself to the springboard of the contemporary BDS narrative. And you started seeing on European campuses, you started seeing on American college campuses, a movement to start divesting from Israel, for Israeli institutions, Israeli individuals, with the clear intention of the isolation aspect that plays into how to isolate Israel in order to make sure that Israel is seen as this target. So Zionism is racism, has become, and even though it was a repeal, it was, in 1991, it doesn't matter. The environment on American college campuses and European college campuses is that Zionism is indeed a racist movement. And so, of course, Jews and Israelis are indeed racist. And so this is also, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, the understanding of how the racism element is also played and has been parachuted onto Israelis and how they treat the environment itself. The other component, which relates to this as well, and is also critical to understand historically speaking, is also the growth of the use of Holocaust inversion within the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. That has also lent itself into how individuals worldwide see the environment and basically are able to shift the metaphor, the David and Goliath metaphor, but to argue that basically Jews and Israelis are Nazis and the Palestinians are indeed they are the poor, David. And so that entire narrative is shifted at large. Again, all of this fortifies the clear narrative of the Palestinians becoming the quintessential gold standard of victimhood and oppression, while the Jews and Israelis at large are representing this kind of voice of power. And again, a kind of use of old anti-Semitic tropes that have fed into this environment at large. So you have a growth of, again, the foundation. You have, I would say, a variety of professors who have grown to create this environment. And this to also spend, it's a little bit, just to expand my point there. While the nucleus of this environment really does live within the area of Middle East studies, I would argue that it has basically been expanded at large to the humanities. The BDS narrative at large today, for sure, there is no campus that is immune to this narrative, but it was not only limited to Middle East studies. You've also seen this living and breathing in the humanities at large, again, because the perspective on what is happening in the Middle East is basically shaped by a settler colonialist kind of viewpoint on the world at large, and how Jews have colonized the area, and and of course, again, positioning the victimhood mentality as it relates to Jews being the victimizers and the poor Palestinians being the victim. And the ultimate solution for that, and to highlight that victimology mentality, has to do with the fact that we need to boycott and isolate the state of Israel. This is the kind of the clear narrative at large. Let me also be clear about the BDS goals and objectives. There is no end game to if you look at the writings of the Boycott and the founders of BDS at large, they make no buts and ifs about what their ultimate goals are. They demand the maximalist goals that will never be achieved. Even if you had a two-state solution tomorrow, or whatever a solution would look like regarding a peaceful environment in the region, that will not stop there. I mean, the fact that the dishonesty that plays into BDS writings and the double standard has no end. Case in point, one of the co-founders of the BDS movement, Barghouti, at the time when he started, much of this movement was a master's student at the University of Tel Aviv, and was asked on record, do you see that as a kind of a is that a problem for you, that you're receiving an education from Israel, but at the same time asking to boycott that same institution? And of course, he said that's a personal matter. So of course, there is no dishonesty. There's no honesty when it comes to these individuals in the way they are portraying the reality at large. And so that is a critical component of this narrative at large. Now, it's also critically important, apropos the ideology and the scholarship. From an historical standpoint, and I would say this, to be true for those of us who spend time on American campuses, and because of that's where I do a lot of my work, I'm focusing a little bit on that arena at large. I would say that up until the mid 90s, one could go to an American college campus and receive, I would say, some balanced education. There were enough people on the right and the left on American college campuses that would allow you to have a balanced education. Really, since then, today it's become harder and harder to come by balanced education, balanced syllabi, especially when it comes to these topics. And really, in many departments and in many classrooms, this has become the only lens in which to view the Middle East is via the lens of the boycott movement. And so, apropos scholarship and ideology, we've seen a growth of professors. We've seen a growth of university institutions, administrators who have signed on to petitions calling for boycott. So, we've seen incidents where professors have refused to give, for example, students letters of recommendation because they support the BDS movement. So students who want to go study abroad in Israel are being shut down. We are seeing, and again, I think, just even to bring it into contemporary environment at large, just looking at the last war that Israel fought in Gaza back in May, if anybody had any illusions about where people stand, they should have no doubt in their minds exactly where the environment is. There have been over, I think I counted, close to 200 statements that came out of universities and departments, from Princeton to Harvard to other associations, all condemning Israel. And again, these were templated statements showing that they had nothing to do with reality on the ground, all condemning Israel for ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, apartheid state, you name it, the kind of all the catchphrases that we know Israel likes to be as being depicted as, has been laughed at as a result of that war in Gaza. And you could see all around that this is basically the understanding. And this is really what is so disingenuous and what is so, I would say, concerning about the degradation of the academy at large is that, especially in the academy, where people have prided themselves on scholarship, research, are willing to buy into, pardon my French, schlock data to no data to validate why they are supporting the idea of boycott. And most of these people, if you ask them to point Gaza or the Palestinian areas on the map, wouldn't know where to look for it and where to find it. But it doesn't matter. The imagery of the victimhood and the understanding of this reality, this is what has shaped this narrative. This is really, where a lot of the hand-to-hand combat is taking place. Beyond all of that, and I think that this is also related to the general environment that we're facing today, is of course that this is not limited just to university professors. This is also coming from the student body. So you have a top-down, bottom-up environment where the training is taking place as well. So graduate students who are now looking to go into the field, if they don't support the existing narrative, the likelihood of them trying to move on career-wise in these areas is going to be, very difficult for them if they are caught into this understanding of trying to interpret or try to understand the research, the area at large, regionally, about what is actually taking place. In my other hat, Steve, to your point, I currently am the executive director of the Association of Middle East Studies in Africa. This was an association that was created after 9/11. It's almost now 14 years ago. Sorry, a little bit after, a few years after 9/11, by the late Fuad Ajami and Bernard Lewis. Again, two significant historical Middle East historians who understood what was going on in the region, and part of the raison d'etre for the creation of ASMIA was to counter groups like MESA, which is the Middle East Studies Association of America, which was predominantly hijacked by individuals who followed the late Edward Said. Said is the perfect example, who was not a Middle East Studies scholar, was a professor of English Lit, and basically became the gold standard of understanding of how the Middle East Studies should be taught. An individual who had no training in Middle East Studies whatsoever, but it didn't matter. Over the years, I've attended meetings of MESA. Right after 9/11, there was a mocking and looking down on people who looked at who really judged the threat of Islamism, who spoke about terrorism. Many of us in that category were mocked as terrorologists or other kind of nicknames that were given to us as a result of them not refusing that, that side of the aisle to actually look at what actually is happening in the region. And part of that is, really did not allow them to predict the region because they were not realistic what was happening in the region. Again, I think this is also part of the disconnect between the reality on the ground, the reality that, or the, the kind of desired reality that they want to teach on campuses, which also speaks exactly to what exactly individuals know or don't know about the region at large. So this is really, the kind of the historical understanding. Steve, how am I doing on time?
You're doing great. Can I throw something into the mix?
Sure, by all means.
And can
it's your show.
But you're the star. Everything you're saying is on point. And but my one area I'd like you to maybe address is this concept of intersectionality. In other words, and if you can, some people may not know what it is, but it does play a big role in groups who otherwise would have no reason to be engaged in BDS.
So the intersectionality concept, which is really, this hierarchy of oppression, or the kind of the connection of so-called oppressed groups who linked, who believe that they are connected to each other by way of their oppression. There was a study that was done, by Crenshaw, who was the author, of this kind of theory, and it related to African American women and their ability to, as far as their earning. This theory has been parachuted and is really the number one kind of driving force behind a lot of the connectivity that exists today in the humanities. In this kind of pyramid of oppression, nobody is more oppressed than the Palestinians, and somehow the Palestinians have become the gold standard of oppression. So if you support a liberal progressive agenda, somehow you have to also connect yourself to the Palestinians. So for example, case in point, women's studies, LGBTQ studies, peace and conflict, African-American studies, somehow their oppression is also linked to the Palestinians. That is also to say, and this is really, to your, I think, to hits the nail on the head to your point, Steve, is the fact that Jews are in a conundrum, because if Jews see themselves as pro-Israel, the pro-Israel community, but individuals who see themselves supporting liberal ideals and also want to be Zionist, you cannot be both. I was actually giving a talk, most of you were in Florida. I was giving a talk during the Women's March when I was giving talks in Tampa. And many of the women in the audience, wanted to go to the Women's March, and this came up. And this was exactly when there was the confrontation between Linda Sarsour at the time and Scarlett Johansson. Johansson said, as an actress, as a Jew, I'm a feminist and I want to be part of it. And the response that she got was, no, you're a Zionist. You cannot be one and the same. You can only say you have to shed basically your Zionism to hold on to your progressive ideals. That's the conundrum that most, within the American Jewish community, who are seeking progressive ideals are facing today, because they are not liberal enough once they want to add the element of Zionism. I will also remind you that as it relates to BDS, Scarlett Johansson was, of course, the spokesman for SodaStream, the Israeli company, and that caused a huge debacle when the commercial was going to be run during the Super Bowl. And Oxfam, which was the British company, which was let her go. There was a whole to do about all of this, but that was the exact example. To Johansson's credit, she stood her ground on this matter. But that's exactly what happens with many of these companies, and SodaStream is one of the best examples. Again, showing the disconnect. A company in Israel that is predominantly that used to employ Orthodox women, Palestinian women, all working together, and they were making at the time about $1,500 a month. When they had to relocate the factory, they were only making $600. If the BDS movement claimed that they are really protecting and highlighting Palestinian rights and whatnot, who are you really protecting if you're hurting your own people? But even to add to the intersectionality, which is another, which is a critical part of what you're saying, this also adds into what you're seeing today. And I'm sure many of you are following some of the issues regarding to the diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the world reality of wokeness that is basically played into this conversation. I've seen, for example, apropos intersectionality and these kind of connections, the connection between Native American studies and the Palestinians. I mean, many of these, by the way, I'm mentioning these departments intentionally because Native American studies, African American studies, American studies, women's studies, these are all part of the list of departments that have all endorsed the BDS movement. There was a big event at Columbia University where they had a massive banner from 1492 to 1948, linking, of course, Native American history into the Palestinian history. Again, there's nothing historically connection between the two, but from an intersectionality perspective, they are linked.
Asaf, excellent answers, comments. Before we move, I'd like to have some of the audience ask questions, but I just want to make one point or one comment. I can remember a few years ago, my wife and I went to the gay and lesbian march in Tel Aviv. We were there with a family member who's gay. And when I came back and I was telling people about this, the term pink washing came out. Oh, they're just doing, the whole concept of pink washing, and they're only doing this to cover up the bad deeds that Israel does. And that's what I would hear. And also the other point is as was titled the Dyke March in Chicago about 4 years ago, was one of the jumping off points where one Jewish group was told to leave because they had the Jewish star on the gay flag.
Right.
But what I'd like to do, while we still have time, and hear from our audience, two people wrote comments so far. Would either of you like to ask your question as opposed to me reading it?
Steve,
you can.
Yeah, Steve, I want, before they speak up, I wanted to add the element that Black Lives Matters, also Black Lives Matter, also, this idea that, those who actually killed George Floyd are being trained by the Israelis. In other words, the intersectionality actually spread to all kinds of groups considered oppressed. And not only just the LGBT and the women, but that went to Black Lives Matter. And at the peak of the crisis, which is even worse. But yes, go on.
Okay.
And to Luis's point, by the way, and he's absolutely right. I mean, this was part of Luis's referring to the deadly exchanges. That has to do with the fact that the argument is that Israel, is a racist country and is also training our military and our armed forces and our police. So they are exporting their racism. After Floyd was tragically killed, there was a tweet less than a half hour later by a Palestinian artist with Floyd draped in a keffiyeh and a Palestinian flag. Again, what is happening today apropos racism in this country is, of course, that the racism here is also projected to the Middle East. So the perception of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship is, of course, that that Jews are white and Palestinians are black, and so that's how the whole narrative is being looked at. Just to contextualize that.
I don't know whether you saw this, Asaf, but Thane Rosenbaum wrote I thought, a terrific piece about Sarah Silverman and how she had essentially signed on with the so-called squad, and now she may be realizing there's a problem there when her own sister is a rabbi in Israel, and
right.
They're not supporting the Iron Dome.
Right. No, I agree.
Yeah. Okay.
I know there are questions, so I don't want to keep people from.
Absolutely. So, who would like? Okay, good. You're up.
Okay, this is Michael Skoll talking. I accept your arguments. I've made your arguments. What often troubles me is I don't hear these same arguments against the BDS movement voiced publicly on a national scale in the U.S. by someone who's convincing. Who are the leaders nationally in the U.S. who are making the anti-BDS arguments? For example, is there anyone in the Biden administration who's standing up and saying, no, here are the facts about the situation. Here's why the BDS movement is wrong. Where are the voices for reason here?
It's a very good question, and thank you for that. I mean, so your question ties in, and this is, maybe I was remiss to mention this, from the get-go. I know somebody here, I think, asked a question about the IRA definition. I see that Michael Bass asked a question about IRA definition. So let me be clear to, this to my understanding. To my understanding, my personal opinion is that BDS is anti-Semitic. And so if that is indeed the case, and we are enforcing anti-Semitism, part of a debate that's happening today in North America is the fact that racism is only one thing. So Jews on campus, and in general have had a problem on two issues. One, they have to prove that anti-Semitism is racism, and B, that they are minorities. On both of these levels, we've had a hard time making the case. And only in North America, well, I would say even in also in parts of Europe, there's a kind of a thriving, quote unquote, healthy debate about the fact that anti-Zionism is legitimate criticism, whereas anti-Semitism is racism. So I don't want to be called a racist. I'm just a critical thinker, and I'm a critic of the Israeli government and their policies. So that's a whole other lecture, but this is also where it kind of bleeds into all of this. From the standpoint, positively from the State Department, including plus over almost 40 countries around the world have adopted the IRA definition. The positive part about the IRA definition is that it includes forms of anti-Israel and anti-Zionism within it. There have been attempts by the Academy over the past few months by groups like the Jerusalem Declaration and the Nexus Group trying to to allow them to still support BDS by not be seen as racist. So the State Department still holds that clear. Blinken early on made the case that he supports, this is indeed, the BDS is anti-Semitic. There is still, under the Trump administration, there was a ratifying of what is known as Title VI, which helped us on campuses to make the case that Jews are indeed minorities, and so we can use that to our advantage when we're trying to argue when we are discriminated on campuses. They have not overturned that executive order yet. Again, I think that there is a problem. You're asking where the voices, the strong, loudest voices. I think what you're seeing today in the Democratic Party in particular is a challenge where these issues like anti-Semitism, which have been cornerstone issues of the Democratic Party, they are being challenged by the progressive element of the party, what we saw now with Iron Dome. And I think that is definitely a challenge. I was also remiss, and obviously implied, but we should also understand that part of our fifth column here is, of course, many people who support the BDS movement are indeed Jews. They start off a debate by saying, as a Jew, I'm Jewish, but, and so the opposition doesn't have those kind of debates. And I think that it's, some politicians are speaking out. I think that, there was a lot more understanding after the Tree of Life synagogue incident, the shootings, even the ADL in the Northeast, right here on the 95 corridor, has identified over the past 5 years close to a 70% increase in anti-Semitic activity, at large. So you can't be blind to all of this. I mean, you can, if you want to, and many people, are ostriches in that regard. But I think that there is an understanding of the problem, related to public, this is where the special envoy on anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, who's been nominated now by the Biden administration, is a Holocaust historian, Jewish studies at Emory. You might remember she was the one who took the famous case with David Irving, the Holocaust denier. And so she knows anti-Semitism. She has her own political views. But again, I think that there is public understanding of the problem, but there is not really a full action step about what to do, is where I see the gap.
Okay. Asaf, so we can get more people in. I'd like Dr. Huberman to ask a question. She had a question. And then,
Yes, I did
Joel,
have a question. The question is, you talked about George Floyd earlier and how the Palestinians use that as propaganda. What did they do with Charlottesville, which was really just a terrible event? How did they handle that?
Also, you saw pro-Palestinian statements in Charlottesville. I mean, that were coming out there. I mean, I think that they don't miss an opportunity to to be part of what is happening. I mean, I would even go deeper than that. The phraseology of the word intifada, which relates to, many of us know, what Palestinians are, how they define the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, or what they, shaking off as far as fighting the fight and the conflict, as far as uprising is, what it's kindly translated to in English. They have used more and more of that terminology, and more Arab American scholars have used or have called for an intifada in America. And so there is a Palestinianization of American politics in some way, shape, or form, and it goes both ways. In the same way that I mentioned on the issue of the race issue, and in looking to understand the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, they've also attempted to use that here in the States as well. So it cuts both ways.
So one last point, the intifada, they can play on the right and the left.
Yes.
Both those margins, they're both radicals.
Agreed. They're happy to take it both ways. I mean, whatever works to the agenda, the end game is not a problem. I mean, the founding fathers, so to speak, of the PLO were mostly Arafat and company were mostly Marxist, than they were, Islamist. When the way they did a lot of the business. And so a lot of that seeped in to the ideology that they have been using in order to activate the campuses.
Terrific. Professor Levin, you're up. You have to unmute.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. Let me just give two quick quibbles. First, I don't think that someone like Saeed was ill-equipped to make the comments he made. He was extremely well-read, extremely well-educated. He was extremely wrong, but I don't think you need to disqualify people who don't have PhDs in Middle East studies. And second, I think Oxfam had a very limited criticism of Israel. It's only manufacturing in the West Bank, and I don't think it could be fairly lumped in with others, but those are quibbles. My real question here is this: it seems to me that the BDS movement has gotten traction for one big reason, and that big reason is Netanyahu. That Netanyahu has embarrassed American Jews for over a decade and has made it very difficult to engage in the kind of defense of Israel when he is so overtly contemptuous. It seems, at least on the public presentation, of sort of the basic humanity of people in Gaza and the West Bank. And what I was wondering is whether you agree with that. That is, it's not just a matter, here we're talking about political traction, and not necessarily who's right on the one hand. And on the other, do you think that with new leadership, some of the problems that American Jews face with regard to anti-Semitism might alleviate with the kind of leadership that Israel has often had. I mean, the Golda Meir leadership rather than the Netanyahu leadership.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, so let me be clear. I mean, a lot of this feeds into the connection between the two centers as relates to American Jews and Israel. There is Israeli politics, I would say, since 98, 99, have shifted more to the right. American politics have gone more to the left. And so there, the left and right issues is part of the gap that exists between the two centers. I think Netanyahu, like American politicians, is an Israeli politician. He's done some good and some bad. The generation of the Goldas and the founding fathers, are no longer part of the political arena. These are the disciples of those individuals and the way they look at it. The interesting part, I would say, that the animosity towards Israel is not limited to labor or Likud. The Holocaust inversion part. The hatred. It doesn't matter what Israel does; it'll still be hated, whether it's Netanyahu or whether it's Bennett. And interestingly enough, I think that elements of Bennett's government are actually more to the right than Netanyahu is. But you have this. Israelis need to have term limits like we have here. That's a problem, in general. That's another political problem that exists. I think that there's a lot of lost in translation today as far as appreciating the environment outside of Israel. Israelis were late to the game relatively in their appreciation of the threat of the boycott movement, and I think that they now they understand that anti-Semitism is indeed on the rise. So it's politically fluid. On the Netanyahu aspect, I mean, again, we want it's a longer conversation, but there's no doubt that Netanyahu and Barack Obama did not love each other or see eye to eye on any issue, and so that fractured relationship did not help. I do think that, on that end, that the strength of the alliance is better to, is to stay true to the no daylight clause as far as trying to resolve problems between the alliance, between the two allies, to try to solve problems. But on today and days of social media, it's much harder to do. And just to be clear on the issue of Said, I just wanted to respond to that point, your quibble. Said was qualified to talk about the issue. My point was, as his involvement with the Middle East Studies Association, which was the umbrella group of scholars of Middle East Studies. He was not a scholar of Middle East Studies. But he became the kind of the gold standard within Middle East Studies at large. And, if you go back to the debate between a guy like Bernard Lewis and Edward Said, this is part of where the challenge took place. Said was a prolific orator and won that debate, no doubt. And was able to capture the sentiment, but it was not an historian of the region. But that's nor here nor there. But I think, but my point on that note was that. Is again, what people see or perceive to see between research and reality on the ground versus what they would like to see. And even Said was wrong on a lot of his predictions when it came to democratization, when it came to the Palestinians. The interesting part regarding BDS, I think that maybe today is an interesting, worthwhile to note. Many of you may have seen the YouTube regarding Ben and Jerry's comments. Of late regarding their tactic on not providing services or food distribution within the settlement areas as it relates to their understanding of what is going on in the region. I think that this is also these kind of soft boycotts have a slippery slope going downhill. But I think that part of the cornerstone of the anti-boycott legislations here in the States is based on the simple understanding that you should not be boycotting an ally of the United States. So long as Israel and the United States are allies, you should not be boycotting each other. That's the premise for the anti-BDS legislation. and it goes, cuts in a variety of different directions. I will say, one more point that I think is critical to understand, to my mind, at least, that the debate on Israel, in many ways, shapes, or form also relates today to American Jewish identity. If you go back, to the beginning of the state, if you go back to 67 and further, Zionism was a core component for American Jews of their own Jewish identity. And I think that since 1967 to today, there's kind of been an erosion of where identity comes in. So people are able to say, I'm Jewish, but. And so a lot of that is what confuses and what is fueling the friction between American Jews and Israelis, and how they see Israeli leaders and policies play out. I'll stop here.
Let me just briefly say, Netanyahu made it pretty clear that he didn't care about liberal Democrats' support for Israel in speech after speech. He also didn't much like George W. Bush. And so this idea that it's just politics and maybe he and Obama disagreed, I think that's the right-wing narrative. The truth is, he spit on American liberal Democrats. And when he wants their support later, they have to say, why do you treat us so badly? And he treated American liberal Democrats badly. And it happened year after year. And he made it clear he didn't care about us. So I understand his politics. As for Edward Said, I wouldn't defend him against anybody in any circumstances, except the fact that I thought he was well-read. And I'll stand by that. And that's all an historian is, well-read. But I still think Netanyahu did an enormous amount of harm, and that harm may continue with his successors. And if Israel doesn't care about American liberal Jews, then they're in trouble. They don't care about Nancy Pelosi, then they're in trouble. And they don't.
I think that Israelis' understanding of American politics is not deep enough. And I think that even the debate that happened now with the bill on Iron Dome, and you saw individuals like Schumer and Steny Hoyer and Pelosi who should know better and stood up, for what took place when it came out of the squad. I think that was telling. I think the question is, how long are they going to be able to stand up to cornerstone issues that have been traditionally part of the Democratic Party? I think that the political toxicity on both sides of the aisle have pushed us far right and far left, and it's hard to find today Reagan Blue Dog, Scoop Jackson Democrats, part of the conversation. And so, the traditional part of the strength of the U.S.-Israel alliance has been rooted in its bipartisanship. And I think that, the fact that, it's become and is becoming more and more partisan is not helpful.
I'd like to just jump in here for 2 seconds, and I appreciate what you said, Joel. Asaf, a number of years ago, I happened to be at the Knesset, and I had a conversation with a number of members of the Knesset, all of whom seem to not care about what goes on in the United States. There seemed to be a disconnect. And I don't know whether you see that, but I was shocked that there just seemed to be little concern about what goes on in this country.
I agree. I mean, look, I think that I don't think most Israelis really understand how American politics work. And I think that, before the elections, there was a poll done in Israel about who they think would be a good president. This was when Clinton and Trump were running. They had no idea who Donald Trump was. They only knew Hillary Clinton, because she was Bill Clinton's wife. And so they remembered the Clinton years, and they remembered Clinton's relationship with Rabin. And so, that's how, and if you ask Israelis about anybody in Machane Yehuda, about AIPAC or anybody else, I mean, that's not the discourse. They like American culture and Americana and whatnot, but American politics, is a much more deeper missing part of the conversation.
So we'll move on here. We have at least one more question. For those who don't know, Machane Yehuda is the central market in Jerusalem. Some may not know that, so that's what Asaf was referencing. Michael Bass posted a question. Did you want to ask your question? or you just posted it as a comment? And while we're waiting for you, let's go back to, it looks like Michael Skoll has another comment or question.
Yes, it seems to me that much of the argument against BDS is being made on the basis that it's anti-Semitic. And that is a difficult argument to prove. I live on the Upper East Side of New York, and the most positive pro-BDS movement in the whole area comes from the Upper West Side of New York, mainly from Jews. It seems to me
someone's bird is chirping. Okay.
It stops. It seems
Oh,
to
it's
me,
you. Sorry.
yeah, it seems to me that there is a more powerful argument against BDS based on the history of Israel, vis-a-vis the Palestinians, what a series of Israeli prime ministers have offered in terms of a two-state solution. Almost none of this seems to be part of the argument against BDS. So many say, oh, it's anti-Semitic. And believe me, if you just say it's anti-Semitic, someone will say to you, what are you talking about? I'm Jewish. How can I be anti-Semitic? It seems to me that the historical, the experiential argument against BDS based on recent last 20, 30 years of Israeli and Palestinian history is, in my opinion, the more powerful argument against BDS, not that it's anti-Semitic.
I don't disagree on some point. I mean, I would just say that, and I would just add to your point, Michael, BDS is ahistorical, it's dishonest. I mean, you know, what it does is it puts the conflict in a box. It makes the entire relationship between Israelis and Palestinians binary. You know, there are victims and victimizers. It's black and white. Anybody who's been to the region, who knows anything about, you know, the Middle East at large, will know that it's rich in culture, theology, politics, and history. And so to boil it down to this kind of, you know, this is what is so unique and so attractive for pro-BDSers, because all you got to say is, you know, it's a black and white issue and we won the debate. But it is intellectually dishonest about anything, you know, regarding the issue. And so that's where I think we do need to make that. But it doesn't, I mean, to my point before, it doesn't call for a two-state solution. It doesn't call for, you know, resolving the issues. It's an argument to destroy Israel, you know, and this is how we're going to do it, with economic warfare, with political warfare, and that's what BDS is about.
Terrific. Does anyone, this is excellent. Does anyone have any more questions? We're up against the hour.
Yes, I would like to add something. Is
okay,
it possible?
Luis. We'll think of that. No, of course. Go ahead, Luis.
Yes, one thing I would like to add, I think Asaf and the questions were terrific, but a few things, okay? I'm speaking for myself and then I speak for a young person that didn't dare to make a comment. The first is, we also have some problems with some of the Zionist people. You know, for instance, J Street, that they call themselves Zionist pro-Israel. But J Street has mobilized people like Andy Levine and others. And the belief behind it is that, well, if you put pressure on Israel, only if Israel stopped the settlements, there would be peace with a two-state solution, which I personally find unrealistic from no matter what angle you look at it, okay? I would like you to make a comment on that. And the second is the following. This young person is telling me that she was kind of impressed negatively by, you know, Israeli forces killing an autistic Arab man, all kinds of killing that actually happened. And the question is, to what extent, what are the pressures under which the soldiers, what are the circumstances under which soldiers sometimes or do these things? Because you know, for a demagogue, the easiest thing to say is, you see, the Israelis are exactly like the American police in Minnesota. They see a black man, they see an Arab, and they immediately think it's dangerous, and so they go shoot them. What would you say? What would you say about the attitude of the IDF, the attitude of the border police, the attitude of the police in general? I was a soldier in the IDF, and I remember how strict, for instance, the rules were with respect to opening fire, with respect to, you know, very strict, up to the point that soldiers were making fun of the commander, saying, well, we are being sent to death. But, you know, that was a joke that went around.
Oh, those rules have not changed, actually. I mean, Israeli rules of engagement are very strict. I mean, look, I think to your point, and one of the points that you were making, I think, look, for the younger generation, you know, who is looking for, you know, what's harder today, and admittedly, one of our biggest challenges is, you know, what I was mentioning before, you know, to Steve's question about the intersectionality, is finding a digestible Zionist progressive narrative that will allow them to be progressive, you know, because look, American Jews and American young Jews are taught to you know, tikkun olam is a religion, social justice, you know, doing good for the world. And so these are the kind of things they're looking for. And that narrative, unfortunately, does not fit within the Middle East reality. And I think, but, you know, to Steve's point about the Pride Parade, I mean, look, you have these kind of oxymoronic, you know, kind of movements of gays for Palestine. I mean, if you're openly gay, you know, in Gaza, you'll be hung. I mean, you know, legitimately, you know, no joke. I mean, the Pride Parade is happening in Tel Aviv. It's not happening in the streets of Gaza. There is more, you know, collaboration between Arab Israelis. Look, I mean, the Israeli Knesset today, you want to talk about democracy, they got an Islamist party, for God's sakes, who is, whose honest charter is the destruction of the state of Israel. And so this is, the Israeli democracy is hardly, not even remotely perfect. It's a Middle East style democracy. It's not an American style democracy. It's not Tocqueville's vision of how democracy works, but it's a parliamentary system that works for Israel. I think as far as freedoms go inside of Israel, there is much more, freedoms for minorities, freedom of the press. I mean, all of this is happening in Israel. It's not happening elsewhere. But I think we do have a challenge as far as to the intersectionality component, that you should not be forced to strip your progressive values when you also want to be a Zionist. But that's what the younger generation who are debating these issues on social media are forced to do. You can't be either or. You got to choose, and that's a big problem. It's a real issue that we're seeing today. And to your other point, which I think has also been some of the the underlying tone with some of the comments that I've heard tonight as well. I mean, again, there are many Jews and Israelis who are part of this movement. I mean, that are making this a very fragmented debate and speak to the fragmentation of the debate in the American Jewish community and in the world Jewish community at large about where people come on the issue, because they believe, to your point, and most Westerners believe that the crux of the conflict is all about, the so-called occupation. It's the religion of the occupation. And I've written, a few articles about this topic myself, making this about a territorial conflict, to say that if Israel got out of the occupied territories, then, peace would come about. If this were solely a territorial conflict, this could have been resolved years ago. It's not a territorial issue. To my mind, the number one issue is really the Palestinian refugees and the right of return. A topic that I've devoted the past 20 years of my life to, and wrote a book on the topic. But I think that there is there is territory involved, but to make it only about that this is solely a territorial matter that could be resolved by the exchange, by swapping of lands, is naive and shows a lack of understanding in what's actually happening on the ground. That's part of the disconnect, but it shows well to show, territory, and Israel is occupying illegally these territories. And so because they stole the land after the Palestinian narrative, all they got to do is give it back and peace will come in, peace in our times. I'm not naive to believe that, and that, that kind of naive narrative does not sit with me. But I think that that's how it's been simplistically interpreted.
Terrific. I think this is a
Yes.
good, go ahead, Luis. You had another question?
No. That is perfect. I think Asaf answered this, and thank you so much, Asaf. Really good.
Yes.
My pleasure.
I think, so we've come to an end. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Romirowsky. By all accounts, this was certainly an excellent webinar. I think we all walked away better informed. And
Appreciate the hospitality.
Thank you. And of course, our collaboration with Scholars for Peace in the Middle East seems to be a success. And we look forward to more collaborative events. And I got to know you even better. So thank you. But most of all, I want to thank all in attendance this evening. Without your presence and participation, our center would not exist. So with that, I'd like to end it, and thank you all for participating, and looking forward to seeing you all at our next event. Good evening.
Thank you. Appreciate
Asaf.
it.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much. Thank you, everybody.